Welcome to the Diversity and Inclusion on Air podcast. This podcast is a program of the Association of American Veterinary Medical Colleges Diversity Matters Initiative. The podcast explores various issues related to diversity and inclusion in the veterinary profession and provides the AAVMC an opportunity to offer ongoing diversity programming to our member institutions as well as all veterinary professionals. My name is Dr. Lisa Greenhill, and I'm the Senior Director for Institutional Research and Diversity at the AAVMC. So, on this episode of the podcast, I am joined by my good friend and colleague, Kim DeBrew. She is the principal consultant at Diversity Dimensions Consulting LLC and co-host of the Visible Women podcast. Be sure to check that out. It's a great show. Kim and I are going to discuss the concepts of equality, equity, and fairness today on the show. The discussion touches on how these concepts shape our understanding of the educational and professional experience. Now, equality, equity, and fairness are often used interchangeably. They're often conflated, but in reality, they're actually quite different. They are related, but they are different. And not only are they different, they often show up in our lives in very different ways. And for some some populations, rather, the distinctions are critical in how rules and guidelines are actually applied to them. What we understand to be fair may be rooted in equity versus equality or equality versus equity. And what all of this looks like in things like admissions, hiring, professional work is really important, really meaningful. And Kim is here to help us understand a bunch of this today. Maybe not all of it because it's too much for one podcast, but we're really excited. Kim DeBrew, welcome back to the show. If you have been a longtime listener, you know that Kim used to be with our collegial organization, the American Dental Education Association, and she was featured on a previous podcast talking about holistic admissions. So welcome back to the show.
Happy to be back with you, Lisa, and with all of the listeners for the AAVMC podcast. You are an inspiration to those of us who want to get our voice out there on behalf of good, on behalf of social justice issues. So thanks for continuing to hold this space for these important conversations.
Thank you so much. So, Kim, for folks that are new to the show listening, why don't you tell them what you're up to these days?
Yeah, so it's been a wonderful journey. As you know, Lisa, I've been in health professions education for pretty much all of my career. I started out as a grassroots community health educator shortly after getting out of graduate school and moved into medical education, then dental education. And now I'm on my own helping support health professions more broadly. So I have clients in the PA education world, in nursing, in medicine, and I'm still keeping close ties with my dental colleagues, where I spent probably 13 years helping support schools who want to step into the diversity, equity, inclusion space in bigger ways, and also grow the faculty ranks of leaders on behalf of these efforts. So I'm consulting and I'm also coaching. I'm working one-on-one with leaders who want to work on themselves. So it's a full practice. I'm excited to be able to be with you to unpack some of the critical issues, distinctions in language in our diversity work become critically important. On having a lexicon that is shared and is understood is almost foundational for any of this work. So I'm glad that we're going to be able to unpack this terminology today.
Well, great. So Kim is awesome. I'm a big fan. We go way back. And I'm delighted to have her on the show. So why don't we just go ahead and dive right in with some definitions. So what is equality?
So can I start with what I'd like to do is if I could start with fairness.
Sure.
Because I think it speaks to, in many ways, a value that is very core to what it means to be in an American education system, right? When we talk about opportunity to education, the notion of fairness, of everyone has a right to education. I mean, it's like, mom and apple pie, right? It really speaks to our core. And I use that as the big umbrella because the way to fairness is at the heart of the matter, right?
Right.
The way that we get to fair. So equity is one route to fairness, right? It acknowledges that resources may be divided and shared unequally to make sure that each person has a fair chance to succeed. It takes into account that people have different access to resources. It takes into account that the system that exists within this country in terms of opportunity is uneven, that systems of oppression and privilege really are in operation in our society. And equity seeks to balance that disparity. So I want to just pause there. So equity is really acknowledges. Let's use one kind of very practical metaphor. Thinking about track and field, right? So
Mm-hmm.
you have a set of runners, and I think in sprints, the fastest runners are, and it's been a while since I've run track. The fastest runners are in like lanes 4 and 5 or 3 and 4. I think it's 4 and 5, right? So they actually have an advantage in those lanes, right? And then the runners that have not qualified as highly, right, are in some of the outer lanes, right? So that is fair, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because you got the fastest time. So you got a preferred slot, right?
Okay.
But equity seeks to kind of balance that, right? Like equity would say, you know what? Somebody might have in that same lane, they might have some rocks. They might have a hurdle. They may
Mm-hmm.
have other things that are in their way. So equity might actually have somebody start a little bit further down the track. So it really seeks to acknowledge the conditions in which those track runners live.
Mm.
So let's and I want to pause there also to say that the importance of us really trying to dig into these definitions are really to understand the words that we use, to understand that the person sitting right next to you in an admissions committee meeting or seated at a leadership table might look at the same thing and see it very differently.
Sure.
And that if we're trying to seek common solutions, if we're trying to actually end up in the same place, then how critically important it is to understand the language that we use. So if I'm sitting next to a colleague and they say, well, I'd like to apply an equity lens to the way that we look at candidates, right? For me, that might mean I want to give extra. Well, let's just talk about a classroom. If you want to look at a classroom situation with an equity lens, that might say, well, for students with some diagnosed
Mm-hmm.
learning challenge, right? They may get extra time on an exam, right?
Yeah.
So that might be. So that's good grounds for equity, right? Like it's a diagnosed condition. But what if for another student, they're coming into classroom hungry, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or had an uneven preparation, right? The things that are less visible, or
Right.
were freaked out every time somebody said, it's a test that's going to judge your, I don't know, intellectual rigor, right? And that triggers some stereotype threat, right?
Mm-hmm.
Equity for that student might mean something totally different. It might be changing the language you use. It might be providing resources so that that student might, have some, make sure that they have groceries, a way to eat regularly, right? Like it may mean two very different things to two colleagues that are sitting at the very same table. So that's equity. Should I keep going, or you have any questions?
So in thinking about that, then moving, clearly we're going to be moving to equality. So equality ends up being that everyone around that table is looking at everyone the exact same way. Well, I'm sorry that Barry is hungry.
Yes.
But, but that doesn't have anything to do with the way that I am assessing Barry versus Julia, who is not hungry.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, so very quickly we can get to sort of the intractable barriers in the system, right? Mm-hmm. It's very easy to over rely on, well, the default is everybody should get the same thing, right? Right. Mm-hmm. And this is where, you and I, when we had sort of our pre-conversation, I felt like we cannot have the conversation about distinctions between equity and equality without first talking about what is starting with the end in mind. What's the goal here, right? So at that same table, right, when we're talking about for the sake of what, do we have policies that are about equality? For the sake of what do we have policies that are around about equity, right? Without answering that question first, I think we're not going to come up with any common solutions and common ground. So let's take the for the sake of what question on, right? For the sake of what are we veterinary medical colleges doing work to educate future practitioners, the future workforce for the profession, right? For the sake of what, right? We want great researchers. We want great practitioners. We want great educators. Say it again.
Food.
We want great food. Exactly. Right, exactly. So these are literally, that actually might be the place to start. And so if that's your starting point, right? All right. So who are the people that we want to train, and how do we actually make sure that they make it into our doors, through our curriculum, and back out again? Mm-hmm. Right. So if we start with that, then, and we apply, let's just go back to our equality lens, right? We apply that equality lens, right? We want to open our doors to anybody that can meet our baseline criteria, right? That is an equality lens, right? And, right, you don't need an admissions committee to do that in some ways, right? You don't need human beings to make that decision, right? You just need it's a numbers game, right? And so,
there's a lot of assumptions in even us saying that it's a numbers game.
Yes, absolutely. Your community better than I. I'm just going to stay out of that.
I mean, one, it assumes things like there isn't bias in tests. It assumes things that grade inflation doesn't exist. It assumes things that that we grade fairly. Fairness. There we go again, right? It assumes a lot of things. But if we are thinking about just this from a quantitative perspective, we're going to just go ahead and provide you and I in this conversation, and all of our listeners, with a little grace, that we're going to assume that all of those things are real and true, and that these are really good, honest to God metrics that are both equal and fair, right?
I love that you made those distinctions, because I think sometimes what happens is the resistance will show up in the form of these factors are so complicated that if we start to think about all of them simultaneously, right? All of the unevenness that was baked into the system all along the pathways and pipelines to an applicant actually making it into our pools, that we might do nothing, right? We
Right.
could be sort of paralyzed by that conversation. So, and the true work is all of it, right? So I
Right.
want to say that as well, right? The true work is really understanding the ways, the myriad ways that people actually make it to our doors or don't, the ways that our pipeline sort of leaks out. And we've thrown away sort of the pipeline analogy a while ago. I really like pathways better
Mm-hmm.
because people are coming and going
Right.
at various points in their career. But anyway, you make it to the pool, right? And we apply a standardized, set of criteria that, again, hopefully based on some internal evidence that distinctions between, a tenth of a GPA point matter. I don't know, or a GPA or a GRE score of, very small percentile, that they actually matter, right? They make it into our pool. You apply the same criteria to all candidates. And if we didn't think that practitioners need to have something else besides the ability to academically make it through a curriculum, then we would not have other
Right.
criteria, right? Like,
Right.
for the sake of what does an essay exist? For the sake of what does an interview exist? They exist because our evidence shows that we need to have better variables to take into account, to look at in order to make decisions, right?
Right.
So if all of that is true, right? If we already have adapted to have interviews and essays, right? Then I wonder, right, for the sake of the candidate, for the sake of the provider, for the sake of the veterinarian that you're looking to grow and nurture and educate, then maybe there is something in there for the learning environment having more different kinds of people. And so this is the case that your work within AAVMC makes all the time, right? We want a classroom that's reflective of the dimensions of difference in our society. We want an environment that's inclusive. We believe sort of the case law of the Supreme Court that says that there's a compelling interest for diversity within the student body, that it improves the learning and the problem solving and all those things. So we build that evidence in to the for the sake of what, then I gotta believe that equity has to show up at that table, right?
Right.
That there's a recognition that if you start to go there, then you have to acknowledge that everybody's starting place is not the same.
Right.
All
Absolutely.
right, so let me pause and have you any reaction or questions.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, if this was just a numbers game, then this would make everyone's life a lot easier.
Yeah.
On the front end,
Yeah.
would it make our lives easier on the back end in terms of the profession? Questionably, no.
Yeah.
And actually, the larger evidence in human resources and in diversity and inclusion in general say, no, it's just not sufficient to just have these kind of very arbitrary metrics, right? And so to your point, that is why we have, you want letters of recommendation, you want essays, you want to know what kind of extracurricular activities they're doing, you want to know, a bit of their background. And so how does this show up during a deliberation, let's say for admissions? Well, it might have someone saying, oh, well, they only took 9 credit hours that semester. But look, they worked 40 hours a week, right? They worked 40 hours a week and then they still went to school. They still took 3 classes or however many classes they took. So what does that look like in terms of holistic rigor in terms
Yeah.
of that individual's life, right? And why did they have to work 40 hours a week? You start asking more questions, and you start thinking about, right, their lived condition and what is it that brought them to have the kind of profile that they have. And you're looking, and everyone's profile is going to be a bit different. Certainly there are markers, I think, that we see consistently across, swaths of our applicant pool, but it's these kind of distinctions that help us understand what makes candidates, air quote, unique, right? That differentiates. And I think that the same thing is true in hiring when you're thinking about things like, why do we do behavioral interviews?
Yeah.
Right? We're trying to understand a bit more about the individual. We don't want to just know what they've done in their previous job experience. That is critically important, but we also want to know what they will bring to the team, and beyond just core metric measurable skills. We want to know what that larger package is, and that really gets to the issue of equity. Because if we're just, again, looking at hardcore skill base,
Yeah.
those are pretty easy decisions to make.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I've been thinking about this issue from the perspective of my other hat, not just as a consultant, but as a coach. And the question that I ask myself is, what's in the way of this conversation having traction within an admissions committee? What's in the way of this conversation having traction among colleagues? And I think there are two fundamental things that come up for me. One is the fundamental belief that people want to have about themselves, which is, I treat people the same. I'm a good person,
Right.
and I just want to um, not make any mistakes with, admissions, right? Like a little bit of a risk. Like I don't want
to be the one that
to be the one,
that admitted the ex
right?
murderer.
Right? Like, so there's a very there's something sort of fundamental about sort of a values around fairness, and then the thing about risk that really is triggering for some, using sort of the physiological thing that happens, right? When people bring up something that challenges either your values or your safety,
Sure.
right? Um, and admissions work, right? Like the decision making feels risky, right? It's a values thing and it's a risk thing. So the conversation that I kind of when I'm working with clients, whether one-on-one on this kind of stuff or in groups, I really try to push to, all right, let's see what things give you safer ground, right? If the threat response is risk, right? Like I don't want to be the one, right? What are the things that help you mitigate risk? So that's the first thing. And the second thing is the value around fairness, the value around treating people the same. How can we serve that value as well, right? And really try to unpack the conversation in that way. So I guess what I'd like to do is just talk about that a little bit, sort of my like easy tips
Sure.
in terms of that, and then this could either be for somebody who wants to actually become more conversant on behalf of their institution with colleagues, or if I'm talking to you, if I'm walking up your street, right? So for the risk folks, right? The folks that are worried. One of the things I used to tell our dental schools all the time is really begin to collect your own data, right? Start to look at who's in your school, right? and what's going on, right? Like, so begin to find out how they made it to your school. So using your example, are there people who only spent 6 hours in clinical settings
Mm-hmm.
and worked 40 hours, right? How are they doing, right? What can you do some interviews with them to find out what was their pathway? What can you learn um, about their journey
Mm-hmm.
that might be good fodder for admissions criteria or for questions that you might want to add as supplemental questions on an application. So my first tip for the person that's kind of squeamish about taking risks is steep yourself in sort of the evidence within your institution. The second is about growing um, um, folks that will can be sort of partners with you in the journey, right? So it's not you sticking your neck out solely, but that you are, sort of coveting with a colleague that we're going to actually take this on together, right? We're going to do a pilot. We're going to try to recruit maybe from a school that really you have not seen a lot of applicants for. It could be, or you might want to have a couple of folks that are from community colleges. I mean, I don't know in veterinary medicine what kind of are the sort of the taboo
Right.
pathways.
Right.
I know in dentistry, when we saw community college applicants, except if they were from California, we were like, oh, let's look deeper in the transcript.
Right.
Or I
Right.
don't know, it was
Sure.
like something that got flagged. But really identify a couple of ways that you could partner with people to kind of like, oh, let's take this on. Partners and champions within a committee. So that's what I would say for the folks that are worried about risk.
Can I
Go ahead. Yeah,
add one
please.
thing though?
Sure.
I mean, in terms of looking for that evidence within your
Mm-hmm.
your institution, or for example, your practice, maybe for professionals who are in practices that are hiring,
Yeah.
beware of confirmation bias. And I have
Oh,
to
yeah.
say that this is really, really important because, and I'm thinking, okay, so I'm gonna tell stories out of school. My daughter will kill me, but my daughter is famous for saying, "Oh, I tell her to do something, and she's like, "Ooh, I don't know, that's pretty risky." I'm like, "Why is that risky?" Well, that one time
Right.
that I did X, Y, and Z, it didn't work out, so I don't want to do it again. So as you're looking at that information and that data, and you're kind of mining data, look for those successful folks and see kind of understanding how and why they're successful. Don't necessarily always focus on the one or twos. That, I mean, there is a risk reward part of admissions and hiring, right? It could always go left, right? It could always go left. But really kind of one of my mentors, Pat Larry, always says, what does success look like? And so focus on that successful piece and say, okay, here are some of the things that we found that are markers of success beyond those kind of, those quantitative things. Like, yes, this person kind of maybe took a lighter course load, but they worked many, many hours, so that by the time they got to vet school actually was, less challenging in terms of managing workload because they're used to that. Right. And so look for those, be mindful of the risk, frankly, of confirmation bias, and focusing on those students who weren't successful, focus on the ones who are.
Yeah, that's a beautiful point. And it is so challenging. I've been guilty of hiring somebody that, I was like, it's something I like about you. You know what? You remind me of myself. Right.
Right.
So
yes, I've also had my own.
Yes.
We all have our stories.
Right. But other extreme is, of course, true, right? You can find extremes at anything, right?
Right.
You could find the student that's like, oh my goodness, wow. It just didn't work out,
It didn't
right?
work out, right.
And you're going to find the students in that who were such a surprise, right? They ended up being such a superstar. So you want to understand that as well. So yeah, that's a great caution.
Yeah. So that other group.
Yeah, that other group is sort of has a value around fairness, right? Like just gets a little uncomfortable where when anyone talks about anything that, dare I say it on air, reeks of favoritism, right? And I honestly, I want you for if that is you, if I'm talking to you or I'm talking to you who's talking to your colleague, I, my first encouragement is look that in the eye, hold up a mirror, right? Like the reality is that, and we know this from, oh my gosh, that admission scandal, right? Like, right? Favoritism is, it is the order of the day, right? Like, we know by all the bias research that that we prefer things that are similar to us. Our brain wants to make shortcuts, right? It wants to, it's lazy and wants to just find the simplest path to understand things. So it's a myth, frankly, that we are, just, we're able to unpack that bias and just, look at the world with brand new eyes. So if that is, so just breathe, take a deep breath. It's all good, right? We're Kim. My name is Kim, right? Like I like people, places, and things that are similar to me, right? And with that knowledge, then set an intention. So, all right. So my intention, my hope, dream, wish, aspiration is to be able to treat people as fairly as I can, is to not make distinctions based on this or that difference, right? Right. All right. So great. All right. So what are the ways, given that that everyone does not start at the same spot on the track and field, what are the ways that you might step into a conversation about fairness in that context, right? What is fairness? It's almost like the redefine. What does it mean to be fair in that context? Sure. That's your starting place. And I feel like your mission really is sort of your anchor. So, there's all this research about the meritocracy myth and how it made its way in the first place into our education system. I would say, jump into that literature. Derek Bach and Bowen and The Shape of the River long ago, right? That tome that we all kind of refer to really talks about really how equity sort of got its rooting and naming it in higher ed. I would say also for human medicine, which I learned to say from you, Lisa, when we look at health disparities, it often is a way to anchor folks for whom fairness is a key value, right? It's understanding not just the outcomes, right? Like, so at the end of looking at a disease process, right? We look at the outcomes. It disproportionately affects this group or that group. But it's also looking at it with, let's just say, for example, a race equity lens, right? So there are all of these other social determinants of health for people from those groups, right? Contributing, exacerbating, being part of that health outcome, right? Uncoupling those two things, right, is giving an incomplete picture. So for people that have sort of a fairness lens, I would say also really understanding kind of what happens at the other end of a workforce that's very homogeneous, right? What are the outcome on behalf of animals? How does the system impacted, right? And that might be a better anchor
Mhm.
in terms of addressing fairness.
Sure. So I have
Yeah.
some other questions for
Oh yeah,
you.
I'm
So
sorry. I'm
let's
going
talk
on and on.
about
Mhm.
so for example, I've been working with a number of groups over the last year, and we're talking about making some changes in admissions and their admissions process and the tools that you use to evaluate applicants, as well as kind of what those metrics are, right?
Mhm.
And so one of the pieces of pushback, and I think that you've kind of addressed what those individuals should do, but what should kind of allies and leaders kind of how might they navigate this? But one of the pieces of pushback is we recognize that there's a system. The existing system does not um, look at applicants in the way that produces all of the diversity that we want, in addition to kind of those, academic blah 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 things
Mhm.
that are very important. So I don't want when folks hear this podcast and say she said blah blah blah. That does not diminish the meaning of the academic portion. We want folks who can actually withstand the rigor of the curriculum. But let's put that on a shelf for a moment. But when we talk about, okay, here are some of the other things that we value, that we find important in terms of the future of the profession, let's change the way that we look at applicants to increase the value and importance that we put on those things. We
Mhm.
have members that will say, whoa, wait a minute, that's changing the rules
Mhm.
for all of these folks who basically thought that they were a shoe-in. So,
Yeah.
and is that fair?
Yeah. So I think also, so first let me acknowledge the question. I think let's assume good intent with the
Sure,
question, right? Let's
absolutely.
assume that it's not just plain old, we don't want to do anything different. Um,
This is not the podcast on resistance to change.
yes, right. So, but let's assume there's a genuine concern about disadvantaging
Sure,
groups, right? And I think that that healthy skepticism is actually built into the way that the Supreme Court's, the current ruling that talks about race based or race
conscious.
conscious. Yes, thank you. Race conscious admissions policy. So it asks you to periodically look at whether or not you could achieve the same outcomes not using race, and then two, that you tailor the way you use it, right?
Right.
So just to make sure that you're not advantaging. So I think it is good practice actually to look at the processes um, in those ways, right? So what would you get in your pool if you just looked at the numbers, right?
Mhm,
Like,
right.
right? And then what would you get using these other um, uh, range of non-cognitive variables, right? Um, so I think those practices are healthy. They give you a leg to stand on, and they help you answer that question, which is, are we disadvantaging other groups, right?
Mhm,
And then if the answer is uh, maybe, right? Maybe we're
mhm,
getting three more students, um, three students of, well, I'll just use students of color just for argument's sake, but it could
sure.
be any dimension of difference. Three more students of color in where there might have been, to say, three white students 10 years ago, right? Or 20 years ago. If that is so, then I would say from a legal and really, I don't know, fairness standpoint, go back to your mission. For the sake of what are you doing it,
Mm,
right? Is your policy in keeping with what you're trying to do? I think that is
mm,
there is totally a conversation there that you could have with alumni, people who are worried and concerned, that says, look, our mission is this, our practice is this. Yes, we got 3 less students than we would have had 20 years ago, but here's what we're trying to do, and here's what we expect from those graduates. I think it's totally anchoring. I think schools would feel even better if they did the work to actually check and see.
Great. So ultimately, I think that I can imagine folks listening to the show, some of those skeptics, and say, well, isn't the ultimate goal equality versus this equity stuff?
Yeah. I don't know. My answer to that is I don't know. I don't know if that's the goal or not. I know that we are in a system that advantages some and disadvantages others, and that in order to ensure that everyone has an opportunity to succeed, that's the equality part, right? Everyone has the opportunity to succeed. If the system isn't set up that way, I don't see a path forward there. So I think what we can ask is just to keep at it, is to be in pursuit of an opportunity for everyone to succeed. And in the meantime, what we have is clunky, uneven, right? Like just the best we can do to get there. Right. And, for folks that are setting up processes, I am actually in favor of revisiting them, right? This did not work in 2017. We need to revisit this, right? That's the wonderful thing about positioning this work at research institutions where there are scholars who are comfortable with the question and the methods, right? Like keep working at it, right? Throw that out. All right, we'll do something new. I know easier said than done in terms of resources. I work for myself now, so I just give people good advice, and then I get to go home and actually sit with the hard work. But yeah, so that's my counsel. Keep at it.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that it underscores kind of what we do in education, right? And that is the constant pursuit of improvement, and that requires us to constantly gut check, constantly evaluate, reevaluate, reassess, pivot, and make adjustments in order for us to achieve our goals. And I think that one of the biggest takeaways from this conversation is that a lot of this work and all of our work has to be mission driven. Right. And that again gets to kind of one of those questions that I always am asking is, what does success look like, and how do we get to yes? Right? How do we get to yes? Let us look at things and look at people a bit differently, and kind of where are they coming from, and what are they bringing? And really kind of think creatively around how do we define what it is that we're looking for, and how do we assess it?
Yeah, what came up for me just now when you were talking is, what's our mindset about this work, right? Like if we had a mindset around equity, what would change, right? If we had a heart set, this is my new adapted word, heart set, right? If we had a both mind and heart set for this, what would our intentions be? How would what we do change if that was top of mind? And I to your point about getting to yes, that's the way you get to yes, right? When you say, look, what's going to happen is we're going to leave this table with a solution, right? That is out front. It's not starting with, let's describe the problem, right? Let's start with, this is a problem we need to solve. Mindset says, all right, we have the solutions. It's a sufficiency mindset. We have what we need. Let's work with it.
Yeah. So as we start to wrap up, one of the things that I think is also important for folks to know is that, and we talked about this in our kind of prep work, is kind of, knowing better and doing better, right?
Yeah.
And there's a whole body of literature. And I certainly talk for folks that know that I'm doing some work also in financial literacy education and kind of understanding human behavior as we learn things, that there are certain things that we learn that we know the kind of arbitrary like stuff about X, right? But that doesn't really reflect how we feel about X. That heart, the heartstrings, that heart part, right? It doesn't necessarily, we know X, but we feel Y. And so knowing better isn't actually, we find,
Doesn't change behavior.
right, in human behavior literature,
No.
we find that knowing better rarely correlates with
Yeah,
doing
I
better.
would be 20 pounds lighter.
Well, I tell
Like,
people all the time, I'm like, I could look like Beyonce, but I really like carbs. Like
yeah.
I love them. And
Mhm.
so I think that it's important for folks to know that whether or not you are doing this work, and by this work I mean diversity and inclusion and or social justice work, does not mean that you've arrived to whatever magic thinking, like that we've got it all figured out. Like, we don't. I have to gut check my equity, fairness, equality lens all the time.
Yes.
Right. And it's a muscle, and you have to kind of develop it and work at it and think about it and have it be something where you mentioned earlier, you have to set an intention.
Mhm.
If this is a value and if fairness is a value for you, then there has to be an intention associated with it for you to kind of sit down and think about, well, what does this really mean? And how do I understand that? And how do I apply it to this particular circumstances that I find myself in?
Mhm.
Whether it's admissions or hiring or watching, CNN, MSNBC, Fox, whatever it is, even in the evaluation of news, like you have to sit down and kind of think about what that intention is.
Mhm. I think I think the starting place for the intention really is, um, it really is, uh, I think anchoring yourself in, how would I describe it? I think it's really just, it's an awareness. It's the same thing that we teach with bias, right? It is right now, where's my emotion? Where's my head? Are they aligned? Um, I think that's critically important.
Mm, yep, absolutely. So, any parting words of wisdom? You've given us lots to think about during this last
Yeah.
hour. Parting words of wisdom for folks that are wrestling with fairness, equity, and equality.
Yeah, I would say the first thing is, when you think ask questions and be curious. Um, I would say challenge your assumptions.
Mhm.
Um, One of the things that I just benefit from in my practice is that I really get curious about what the experience of others is. So if, for example, there's some students and you're like, wow, their experience is so unique, like, invite them to lunch, really try to understand more about that journey, perhaps, so that, when it comes to decision making, when it comes to conversations with colleagues, you're able to kind of, it's steeped in some other data.
Sure.
Um, and I would say also, eh, tr- to the extent you can, when there are feelings of discomfort, guilt, anxiety, those triggering moments, that you notice them first, and choose your action once you notice them, right? So often what's happening is that we're acting out of sort of our feeling, not our thinking. So it is to slow down and say, oh, wow, right? I'm not driving the car. The car is driving me, right? I'm acting out of fear, right? I'm acting out of, oh, I don't know the answer. Right? Somebody very influential said this is not a good idea, so let me back down, right? Notice it, and then, buy yourself time. Ask a good question. I'm curious, what made you say that?
Yeah.
Right? Just, give yourself a minute.
Don't be afraid of the discourse.
Do not be afraid of the discourse.
So, all right. This has been a great discussion. So before I let you go, tell us about your podcast, Kim.
Yeah. So I am about 9 months into a podcast called the Visible Women Podcast. We highlight issues related to women of color, diversity, inclusion, and appearance, and we put them in the spotlight. So our shows include topics like millennials and faith. We talk about silencing in the workplace. We talk about authenticity. We talk about style and power, which is our most recent episode. And our goal really is to encourage women who may feel like they're in the margins, may have been even pushed to the margins, to really step into a much more visible place. And for people who are already in visible places, really making their inner light shine even brighter. So it's great conversations. We're bi-weekly, and with my co-host, Corinne Corbett.
Yeah, it's a fun show. I listen. I'm a big fan. For folks that know that I'm a podcast junkie, it's a great show, and Lord knows I've mined some ideas, including the most recent episode that we released on what does it mean to look professional on our show.
Oh, good.
A fun conversation about hair and tattoos and, where does the blue blazer come from, and all of these kinds of things, and kind of how do people show up and how do people learn these kinds of trappings of what it means to look professional. And there's certainly issues around gender, there's issues around culture, there's issues around generation. I certainly get some really great ideas from the Visible Women podcast, because there's some great overlap sometimes in some content there. So be sure to check out that show.
Great. Awesome. Sounds good. Lisa, thank you so much for having me. This was a great conversation.
Well, thank you so much for joining us for that conversation. I think it's an important one, and one that we'll probably be continuing in the future. So this is another episode of AAVMC's Diversity and Inclusion on Air, focusing on equality, equity, and fairness. You can find back episodes of the podcast on SoundCloud, iTunes, Stitcher, all of your favorite podcast apps. You can also be sure to like our Facebook page, AAVMC Diversity and Inclusion on Air podcasts, for more information about the shows and diversity and inclusion topics in higher ed in general. So with that, I will say goodbye to everyone, especially Kim. Thank you so much again for joining us.
So great to be with you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.